can't remember if I was the one who suggested it or if somebody else did, but I was certainly the one who first collected the germplasm. And that was back in 1994. Alan Taylor and I went on a field trip to Cook's Peak. And we went down to Cook Peak in Luna County, New Mexico. And the reason we went there was to collect seed of the Arizona cypress. That's the northernmost Arizona cypress, the hardiest form. And I'd never seen it before. And I said, Alan, you can't go down to Cook Peak without taking me. And it was in September, I believe, of 1994. We went up to Cook Peak, and Alan, he drove on that trip. And I remember it was phenomenal. I mean, he got the permission of the ranchers who own most of Cook Peak, and we had to go through all these gates. And the flora there, of course, that's Chihuahuan desert flora. It's very, very rich. And there were just tons of, there were beryl cacti on the way up. Phaerocactus woosleyii, some of them were 4 or 5 feet tall, and I was thinking, I couldn't believe it was central New Mexico and it had all these incredible plants. And we start driving up the mountain through the oak forest and the pine forest, and it was about 7,000 feet. There was a big ridge, and it had the Arizona cypress growing on that ridge. And I went back recently with some staff, almost 20 years after that initial find, and we went back, and most of the trees were dead because they'd had a tremendous drought. But back in 1994, they were in great health, windswept, beautiful cypresses. And we were looking for seed. We got seed, and that's where much of the seed of the cypresses that in our gardens today comes from. And while I was there, I saw one plant that looked kind of like a penstemon, and it was in the sort of shady area, right around 7,000 feet. And I vaguely remembered that there was a scrophularia that grew in New Mexico that was pretty rare. And since then, I think it's been put on the endangered species list, but back then it wasn't. And at any rate, I remember going, and its capsules were not quite ripe, but one capsule was brownish, and that one capsule is what I collected, and there were maybe 50 or 100 seed in it. And from that one capsule comes all of the red birds of the tree that are growing all over the world today. I brought it back, we grew it, I was amazed by it. It bloomed the first year, I think 1995 or something. And I shared seed with Q, where it was a tremendous success. And I shared seed with David Salmon. And he was the one who really launched it in High Country Gardens, and he gave it that name, which I'll never forget. The first time I opened up the catalog, and there's my plants, red birds in a tree. And I'm looking at it and I thought, red birds in a tree. What a crazy name that is. And it turns out, like the other names that David gives plants, Blonde Ambition, he has a flair. So that's kind of the story of red birds in a tree. Well, I've been very lucky. I've worked at Denver Botanic Gardens now. This will be my 39th year that I'm starting. And of the 39 years I've worked here, I've had many fantastic things occur in my career. The Botanic Gardens is 10 times bigger than when I started, 10 times more staff, 10 times more activities, and I've been involved with many exciting projects that have evolved. Xeriscape, for example. Xeriscape was kind of launched in Colorado, and I've been around right from the start of Xeriscape. But Plant Select, I think of all the things that I've been involved with, Plant Select, I would say, has been probably the most gratifying. And I'll tell you why, because I think Plant Select has been the program that has had the largest impact all over the world. Plant Select is really about taking these plants that we work with in a public garden like Denver. There are 1,000 botanic gardens around the world, and they all have plant collections, but very few make them accessible. Most of them hoard the plants, like you can't have these plants. But on the contrary, we have picked these plants and worked with the countries where they come from and the people who've developed them. And through Plant Select and partnering with Colorado State, and particularly with an extraordinary industry across the world. I mean, there's 93 propagators, or maybe there's 94. We seem to add one every other day or so. There are literally hundreds of retail nurseries. There are thousands of landscapers and keen amateurs, tens of thousands of keen amateurs who love this program and who are actively involved. So you take a plant, for example, we'll have something out in the garden, and somebody will say, "Hey, that's a cool plant. We got hybrids of a penstemon that were sent to us by a lumberjack. And it was his hobby up in White Salmon, Washington, to hybridize penstemons. And he had this group, he called them Mexicalis, and he sent the seed to us, and we grew them, we shared them, and I had a nurseryman friend come to me and say, you know, this is a great plant. You should put this in this new program of yours called Plant Select. And it was Red Rocks. And from one little plant that we had gotten as a sort of a, just part of our collections, and we'd shared it with the nursery, Red Rocks has become a plant that has been grown all over the world, and it's started literally dozens of seed strains. Every seed company in the world now has a Mexicali based on Red Rocks. So what other thing that have we done that has had this kind of impact? Really nothing. So Plant Select is exciting. If you don't know the program, check the website. It's fantastic. And better yet, buy the book, Pretty Tough Plants. It's an extremely reasonably priced book. You can get it, on many websites like Amazon. I hate to give them a plug, but check it. It's extremely reasonably priced. And I don't know anybody who has that book who doesn't really treasure it. And it tells you the whole story and gives you the background on well over 100 plants. Native plants. I know natives are really hot right now. It's like pollinators are hot. We have these periods. Most people aren't too crazy about native plants in their gardens. They like the idea of them, but when they put them in their gardens, native plants tend to be kind of scruffy. And yet there's people who say that's all we should grow. Well, I don't buy that we should grow just natives, because I think that our gardens are really about growing good plants, making a beautiful setting. But I do think that natives are an important part of what we do. And I certainly have a big section of my garden which is just native plants. And I think Plant Select has done a really good job of the largest single grouping of plants in Plant Select are Western native plants. And for me, a native plant simply means a plant that comes from the area not too far from where you are, that sort of is adapted to your climate and has evolved there. And I do think that one of the things that we have done is do selections. And that's not a bad thing, even though the purists say, oh, it should be all wild. But I think gardens, and especially landscape architects, kind of need something predictable. So one of the greatest contributions I think Plant Select has done is to take our local manzanitas, for example, and we have these strains. You can get a very dwarf one like mock bearberry, or we have larger ones, and you can actually get something which is predictable and adapted. And certainly it'll produce seed, and maybe someday it'll propagate that way too. But having native plants that are that have a niche that you can define in your garden, that's a tremendous service that the program has provided.